So in this lecture, we're going to talk about Secure Shell and how we can use it to talk to the Raspberry Pi and to other machines remotely. So Secure Shell, SSH shorthand, is a program that allows you to access a machine remotely. So a shell, we've actually talked about what a shell is in a previous lecture, but a shell is just a program that accepts your commands and interprets your commands. So for instance, if you type into the shell, it's what you see at a console. So if you type into the shell ls, then it'll interpret that, and ls means directory, so it'll give you a directory listing in Linux, right? So ls is prompting you for that. If you type cd, that'll change directory, and so on. So a shell is just a basic program where you type into it, it interprets the command, it executes the command, and it prints out the results to you. So that's all a shell is, and that shell is what LXterminal does for you. LXterminal runs a shell in Raspbian and Raspberry Pi. So Secure Shell is basically a way to get a remote shell. So say you've got your Raspberry Pi in your house, and I'm at work, and I want to connect to your Raspberry Pi at your house. Right? So I want to have a shell open up on my local machine. Say I'm sitting at a laptop. I want to have a shell on my laptop where when I type commands in, it sends those commands to the Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi executes the commands, and the results come back to my screen. So I can be at a remote machine and type into it and access it just like I was accessing my Raspberry Pi remotely, or vice versa. So I can be sitting at my Raspberry Pi at home, and that can be connected to I can use Secure Shell to connect to my computer on my desk in my office. And so I can type into my Raspberry Pi ls, and that will send that command to my machine on my desk, and the directory on the machine on my desk will appear on my screen. So we're going to use Secure Shell for that. Now, just for a little background, Secure Shell, its predecessor, really, I'll call it its predecessor, is a program called Telnet. Telnet is the same thing. It's a remote shell, but it's not secure. So it doesn't encrypt the traffic in transit. So don't use Telnet unless you do not care if the world sees what you're typing. Okay. So generally, I never use Telnet now except for experiments to try out things with actually I try out a few I test things with it. But anything serious, anything that you're really doing, you use Secure Shell instead of Telnet. So we're going to use Secure Shell. So Secure Shell is useful for a lot of things. Actually, one good thing, especially for Raspberry Pi, one really good thing about using Secure Shell with a Raspberry Pi is that Raspberry Pi, you'll notice when you get it out the box, it doesn't have a screen, it doesn't have keyboard, mouse, any of that. So you need to connect a screen to it, connect a keyboard, connect a mouse. But if you use Secure Shell, you don't have to do that. You can just connect your Raspberry Pi up to the network, Wi-Fi say. Then you can go to your laptop and connect to the Raspberry Pi and type into your laptop, and it'll send it straight to Raspberry Pi, and you can see the results. So you can use your Raspberry Pi without connecting up a physical keyboard and mouse and screen if you use Secure Shell to remotely connect to it. So that's another thing that's really useful to do with a Raspberry Pi. I use it a lot actually in making these slides. When I was doing screenshots, some of them I did on the Raspberry Pi itself, but some of them I did remotely, and you get the same screenshot because it's Secure Shell running. Okay, so whenever you do Secure Shell, there are two machines involved, and this is sort of generally how the internet works, right? You have this client-server model. So on the one side, you got the Secure Shell server, and the Secure Shell server is a program that's running on the machine that you want to access remotely. So if I want to, if I'm on my laptop, I want to access the Raspberry Pi, I would have to run a Secure Shell server on the Raspberry Pi. Then the Secure Shell client that's a program that's running on the machine that I'm using to access the server. So in the case where from my laptop, I want to talk to my Raspberry Pi, but I want to sit at my laptop, the laptop is running Secure Shell client, the Raspberry Pi is running Secure Shell server. So you have to have both those machines involved in the communication, and two different programs. So basically, the whole Secure Shell protocol is two programs talking to each other across a network. So the commands you type into the client will be sent to the server and executed on the server. And then the responses, the results, whatever text appears on the screen, that is sent back to the client and appears on the client screen. Now, basic Secure Shell, which is what we'll be dealing with, involves only a terminal interface, basically a text-based interface. So it'll look just like LXterminal on the Raspberry Pi. It'll just, you get text, no graphics, no GUI. Now you can get Secure Shell clients that do run GUI. Well, not Secure Shell, but you can get something equivalent. Okay, we're not actually going to cover that. We'll just do it text-based right now because it's simpler. But you can do GUI too. Commonly, I don't prefer GUI. Two reasons. One thing is I remember all the commands, the text-based commands, so I don't need the GUI. But second, that it slows things down. Because if you send graphics, that takes a lot of network bandwidth, right, relative to text. And if you just send LS, all you're sending is LS plus a little bit of packaging, right? If you have to send an image or something like that, then of course is going to take a lot more network bandwidth. So I generally tend to use just a text-based Secure Shell anyway, and that's what we'll be using here. Okay, so requirements. In order to run Secure Shell, first, both machines have to be on the internet, right? They both have to be connected to the internet somehow. Both have addresses on the internet. You must have a Secure Shell client program running on the client machine. So if my client machine is a laptop, then I've got to have a Secure Shell client running on the laptop. Now, Secure Shell clients, if you install a Linux application, a Linux operating system on your machine, or Mac OS X, which is essentially a a nice-looking Linux, either one of those two will have Secure Shell clients built in, right, by default. Now, if you're running instead, if you're running on a Windows machine, then you're going to have to download a Secure Shell client of some kind. Usually I use PuTTY, P-U-T-T-Y. Okay, so next requirement, the machine being controlled has to be running a Secure Shell server. So not only does it have to have a Secure Shell server program installed, but that has to be executing. Okay, it has to be executing when you want to do the connection. So this is actually default on the Raspberry Pi, on Raspbian specifically. When you start Raspbian, it has a Secure Shell server, daemon is what they're called in Linux or Unix, that's running by default. So as soon as you boot up your Raspberry Pi, in the background, one of your background processes is this Secure Shell server that's just sitting there running, waiting for connections. Okay. So in Raspbian, that's default. Other Linuxes, so say you download like on my Linux box at work, when I download Linux onto that, it has a Secure Shell server program, but it's not running by default. So I have to go and set it up. I have to go and change the boot script so that it starts it running at boot time. Actually, now I have set that up recently. So yeah, my machine at work, it has that set up, but by default it wouldn't, but the Raspberry Pi does. Also, if you have Secure Shell, if you're trying to do it on a Windows machine, run a server, you have to download and install a Secure Shell server first for your Windows machine, and then then set it up so that it runs at boot time, runs as soon as you start the machine, if you're doing it on a Windows machine. Okay, another thing is that on the server machine, the machine that you're connecting to, you have to have an account. Okay, so you can't just blindly connect to a server. The server is going to ask you for a username and a password. So you have to have a valid account credentials, valid username and password on the server machine, or else this whole mechanism won't work. Because the whole point of Secure Shell is to verify the credentials, right? To check that you really are entitled to connect to this machine and send this data, receive this data. Yes. And one other thing, any firewall needs to allow Secure Shell access. So if there is a firewall, then it has to be opened up to allow Secure Shell access, which may or may not be default. If it's in my office, that's by default, that firewall port is shut down, and I have to ask the administrator to turn that on. But if it's a public network, it shouldn't be a problem. Thank you.